have to say, I feel a bit stupid again. This happens from time to time when I try something I've not really tried for quite a long time. I've spent tens of thousands of pounds on amplifiers. I think I did a video on this, and I think probably £40,000 over like my career as a guitarist has been spent on guitar amps, and so little of it has been focused in the Marshall territory that I'm actually a little bit embarrassed, particularly when I'm starting to think that maybe Marshall was something I should have been looking at for my lead tones a long time ago.
This channel is supported by TrueFire. TrueFire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses.
Why I think I neglected Marshall and Marshall flavoured stuff. So we're talking about, I guess, the Brit flavoured drive stuff. This is actually not a Marshall. This is a Head First, a board which is made up of two essentially Friedman Dirty Shirleys, which is Marshall JTM 45 flavoured. I'm going to presume that this sounds somewhat like a Marshall amplifier for the purposes of this video. Only going to illustrate the point that really I should be trying something actually with a Marshall badge on it. Let me know which you think I should try in the comments if you've got any opinions on this sort of stuff. But basically, I had a Marshall AVT 150, which I think the valve state stuff is maybe not an ideal representation of what a Marshall could or should sound like. The other things that I've tried, I had a Marshall Origin 20, which actually I thought was very good for the money. I had a Marshall JTM 45, the Blues Breaker, but that had an issue with it where it was so loud for home volumes that it was basically a clean amplifier. And there's an underrated side of the Marshall stuff where, you know, the cleans on these things are fantastic, but I'm looking at these for my kind of lead tones. And yeah, so the JTM 45 Blues Breaker combo, backbreakingly heavy as well. Recently enough, I tried my buddy Chris, Dr. Chris Elphick. I tried his TSL. I did a video on this, basically the most hated Marshall. It's one of the ones that has got a really bad name for itself. But even that, I have to say, was super enjoyable to play. And this even more so. So I wanted to talk about this side of things. Basically, after the AVT 150, ended up buying a Mesa Boogie Nomad 45, and that started a long trajectory of basically only really focusing on Mesa Boogie amplifiers. In lockdown, I bought a load of Mesas. I've owned probably 10-15 Mesa Boogies in a relatively short space of time. And also this little kind of side quest of Dumble sort of tones where I thought maybe I was going for like a Dumble tone, and you know, you hear Robin Ford playing on stuff and amazing stuff. Eric Johnson had a Dumble at one point or another, and you think, well, maybe that's the answer. And VHT D50 was a very fine example of this. Cherrytone, a 2-rock. I've had various Fuchs amplifiers, but here's the thing. When I plug into the Marshall with almost no fight, and this is at a very usable volume, it's getting me things, or the Marshall style things, sorry, which are super close to what I'd think would work for me live. So here. When I add delay to this, some inspired playing there. But for some reason, what I thought of the Marshall sound as, because I've tried some of the either think products from way back in the day that were not amazing, or also the I borrowed my buddy Chris's. I played his Silver Jubilee, the tiny little slash combo, and also the JCM 800 Studio Vintage series like the SV20. Neither of which really sounded like that, and maybe Friedman has kind of bridged that gap between Marshall and Mesa. For me now, when I play a lot of Mesa amplifiers, or have done, there were two things that wouldn't really happen. So first of all, if I set things up to have that smooth kind of top end, what wouldn't happen is I wouldn't be able to back on the volume, basically, because it would just have like a really bloated sound. So that's maybe one thing that I feel like the Marshall side of stuff, or the British side of stuff, seems to me to retain a little bit better, where I can use the volume pot, back things off, and still enjoy the tone. Whereas with the Mesa side of stuff and the Dumble side of stuff, what I found was the way that I was setting them up to get the smooth, sustaining kind of lead tones, I was basically ending up with a more bloated tone that when you back the volume off, kind of just disappeared into like an even more nasal kind of sound. So I'm thinking like, it's the Marshall thing for me more so, and why have I waited until I was 35 and basically, yeah, it was too late. So one of the things that is not so positive with this is that this amplifier in particular, and I think might be the case with quite a lot of Marshalls, seems to me to be really geared towards wanting to break up. So this is the clean, and that's with the gain at like basically off. As soon as I put a little bit more gain on, it like wants to be driven, and it's that part of the deal with a Marshall style amplifier, that either it's optimized for gain or optimized for clean. And is that why, you know, your gurus like Eric Johnson and so on will just rely on a Fender for, you know, like a deluxe reverb or a twin for your clean side of stuff, and just not even worry about the Marshall being a clean amp, because you do hear like amps like Plexis have really good clean tones. You sometimes hear people talk about them. Well, that's the thing, like a Plexi has to be incredibly loud to get the more kind of singing lead tones. This amplifier in particular, like the Friedman Dirty Shirley, can get amazing driven tones at any volume, but then you sort of sacrifice the clean tones. So maybe that's why I've skipped it, and maybe I'm going to have to be starting to think, could I do something like this with a dual amp rig? But I think there is something to this where these Marshall style circuits, to me, when I'm thinking about my ideal kind of lead tone, is actually way closer there, even with the knobs. You know, I've got the bass, middle and treble at kind of 3, the presence at about 2, volume and gain are very high. I've not got a boosting gauge there, but it's so much closer to what I think of as my ideal lead tone, whereas on like a Mesa Boogie Mark, I'd be having the presence all the way off. I'd be probably dialing the treble back a bit, you know, and things might just end up sounding like a bit more bloated than ideally I'd like. This seems to be a way closer experience to what I'd think an amp for me would sound like. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I had a bunch of you guys, I think, really enjoying the tones that I've kind of dialed in with the tube driver and this particular amp, and it's kind of made me think, well, maybe I've been neglecting this side of things. You know, you can grab a Silver Jubilee, you can grab a JVM 410H, you can grab these Marshall amps in the UK for really affordable prices, and maybe that's an area that I should have been exploring over these years when I basically bought the same Mesa Boogie over and over again. Something with Marshall on the badge might have been a better idea, right? And particularly when I was looking for clean tones, I think I was looking at like multi-channel amplifiers, when really going for a deluxe reverb or a pro reverb like I've actually ended up with here might have just been a better off clean. And maybe you just separate church and state and say, right, I'm going to have a good clean amp, I'm going to have a great drive amp, and maybe you figure out how to get that rig happening with those two things. It's going to create some issues for load-in, and I'm then got other issues about how would you actually set up the effects to work with both. You just have a clean A and B rig, and I don't know, how do you actually work a dual amp rig like Eric Johnson does? I guess you go back and you just look at Eric Johnson's rig and use that as your starting point. Even if you're not aiming for the same tones, I think the principle is that the Marshall drive kind of does things you want, the Fender Clean does the things you want, so building a rig around those two things could be a thing, right? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.